Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we'd like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description that will take you to a full gospel presentation, as well as how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you and help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we get into our study today, we are in session 9, and session 9 is titled God Provides. And we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 through 15. So again, we're in session 9, titled God Provides, looking at 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 through 15. And as we begin our study today, I want you to think about either a story or a movie where an underdog is kind of in the run and an underdog is trying to win. The first movie that kind of popped to my mind was there was a kids movie that came out when I was a kid about football, and it was called Little Giants. And the story was about kind of a Texas town that was famous for their football program, specifically their Pee Wee football program. And but because of that, and because it was so prestigious, they would have tryouts, and a lot of the kids didn't get to play on the team if they weren't clearly developmentally advantaged and all that type of stuff. And so a group of ragamuffin kids all came together and formed their own team. And when it was all said and done, those two teams had a playoff to see who got to actually represent the city or represent this town. And the underdogs trying to defeat the trained and athletic dominant team. And it was the story of the Cowboys, which was the good team, versus the Little Giants, which was the kind of underdog team, and what they did to win and how they overcame things and believed in themselves. And it was just a fun story. It was entertaining. It was about life and family and all of that good stuff. And we like those movies. It probably does not take much for us to think about different underdog stories, and they could be underdogs about sports. They could be about, battle. It could be about relationships where there's an underdog. There's the person who you shouldn't think has a chance that somehow manages to overcome and manages to find the victory. And I want you to think about that. Think about maybe a story or a book you've read, maybe a story from real life or a movie that you've watched. And with that in mind, I want to ask this question. Why do we like to hear stories about heroes, especially when they are considered to be the least likely to deliver? And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause the video and actually take some time to interact with me as we go through this video. So if you're watching this by yourself, get a pen and paper, and as I ask questions, pause the video, write some things down, and whenever you're ready, hit play. If you're watching this with your spouse or with your family, we would encourage you to, again, pause the video and have that actual discussion, talk about those things. And again, whenever you're ready, just hit play again. So here's the question we want you to pause the video and answer today. And it's, why do we like to hear stories about heroes most who have considered or who are considered to be the least likely to deliver? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, I hope you've had some good discussion on that. I think for me, the biggest thing is I like to put myself in their shoes. I'm not particularly good or dominant in really just about anything. And so when you see the underdog who overcomes and gets that victory, it's always such a neat thing and such a neat opportunity. The book goes on to say this. It says, everyone loves an underdog story. Today we see how God used some unlikely heroes to bring hope to a hopeless situation. And so what we're going to do is we drop into 1 Kings chapter 7. We are going to find Israel, the nation of Israel, which this is the northern kingdom, not the United Kingdom. The northern kingdom has been besieged by the armies of Aram, A-R-A-M, Aram. And what's happened is they've kind of surrounded what I'm guessing is this area, the capital city of Samaria, which should be Damascus, and they have laid siege to it, and these people are in absolutely desperate state. What this meant for them is all food had been cut off, all water had been cut off, all provisions had been cut off. The general idea is when a foreign nation laid siege to a city, they knew that because of the walls and because of the protection that it had within its city gates and its city walls, they couldn't just, more often than not, they couldn't just take the city without an overwhelming loss of life. So what they would end up doing a lot of times is they would siege the city and they would cut off all its supplies from the outside. They couldn't grow grain. They couldn't, if they had farmers, they couldn't come in and out. A lot of times all the people that lived out in the countryside would run to the city when they knew that a foreign army was invading. And then they would cut all that off, and then they would just wait. And they would allow the water to run out and the food to run out and the provisions to run out until people eventually were starving to death. And then, once they got to that point, then they might invade when they were too weak to fight. But more often than not, cities would ultimately end up surrendering because their choice was either surrender to this foreign nation and go under their rule or die of starvation. And so that's what they would do. And that's really where they were at in this situation. The city of Damascus, the capital of Samaria, was an absolutely desperate situation. For the people of Samaria, the situation seemed truly dire, and yet change was coming. Let's see that change, and we're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 7, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2. And as I read that passage, I would like you to listen for Elisha's hopeful proclamation. So this is what it says. It says, Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, at Samaria's gate, 6 quarts of fine flour will sell for a ½ ounce of silver, and 12 quarts of barley will sell for ½ ounce of silver." Then the captain, the king's right-hand man, responded to the man of God and said, "Look, even if the Lord were to make windows in heaven, could this really happen?" Elijah announced, "You will in fact see it with your own eyes, but you won't eat any of it." So as we look at this passage, we get good news from Elijah. Now, by this point, remember, Elijah has gone on to be with the Lord, and now it's Elisha, his successor, that is making this proclamation. And what he does is he makes a proclamation that says, by this time tomorrow, wheat is going to cost this much and barley is going to cost this much. And I know that we don't have a good understanding of all those measurements and how much silver and all that stuff, but to say the least is it means that it is going to be almost just horribly inexpensive. There's going to be such an abundance of the barley and even fine flour that it's going to be worth practically nothing. Well, at this point in time, like I said, these people are starving to death. They have nothing. They don't know what they're going to do next. They're in really bad shape. And so, contrary to what we see happening here, flour or barley would be worth a huge amount. People would give up everything if they had the means to make one more piece of bread or just a little bit of food in order to survive a few more days or to have some sort of food in their belly, some sort of nutrients. And he's saying by this time tomorrow there will be such an overabundance of food in the city that the food will practically be worthless. If we focus in for just a moment on verse 2, we recognize that the captain, which it says is the king's right-hand man, kind of responds with disbelief. He says, even if God were to open up the windows of heaven, even if God was going to open up the floodgates and just pour out food on us, how could that happen? How could we go from our situation now and receive so much food that the food would almost feel worthless in like 24 hours? It begs the question, the book asks this question, why is it so easy for our current circumstances to affect our outlook on life? And if we think about that for just a moment, oftentimes it's our current circumstances that speak the loudest. When we are hungry, when we are desperate, when we are insecure, when we are afraid, when we think failure is right around the corner, whatever, those are often the things that speak to us the loudest. And so with the Word of God and with the promises of God, often they can't seem to get to our head because we allow all of the noise of the things that are right in front of us to dominate that. And I think this is true of everybody. We all struggle with this, from the pastor down to the youngest kid. What is right in front of us tends to be the loudest and tend to be the thing that dominates our situation. And I think that's true for the king's man in this moment. Is like he is at this moment, he is sensing the desperation, he is feeling the hunger, he is seeing the fear and the worry on the faces of all of the people in the city, and he's like, this is our situation right now. How on earth could it change? And so that moment right then and there was so loud that he couldn't even believe, he couldn't even wrap his mind around what God could do. And even though he acknowledges, well, even if God could do this, which God could, how could it turn around that fast? It's almost like that statement, well, it's never happened that way before. Like in any other time, in any other situation, this has been what it's like. We've never done it this way before. We've never seen it happen this way before. What makes you think it's going to work now? And that's what Elijah is addressing. The book goes on to this. It says, when you compare Elijah with the king's right-hand man, we see a stark contrast between scarcity and abundance. Not only when it comes to food and those type of things, but with the amount of faith and ability to trust in God and all those things. These two contrast each other very tremendously. The right-hand man of God has a severe lack of faith to the point that he just cannot believe what Elisha is saying. And then you have Elisha, who has been threatened in the passage before this, been threatened to be killed by the king because they think that he's brought this calamity upon them. And yet he's the one with enough faith to say, listen, in 24 hours time, by this time tomorrow, we're going to have an overabundance of things. There's just a huge difference between these two men. Now, when we think about that, it makes us ask this question. It says this in the book. It says, Elisha proclaimed the king's right-hand man would see the abundance of food with his own eyes, but he would not be able to enjoy it. Then the book asks this question. It says, how might our personal and past experience sometimes cause us to doubt the promises of God? Why don't we take a couple minutes and discuss that? Pause the video, and then when you're ready, just hit play again. I'll ask the question again. How might our personal and past experiences sometimes cause us to doubt the promises of God? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right. When you think about maybe how your personal or past experiences might cause you to doubt the promises of God, I think a lot of times there are times in our life where we have expectations of God. They may not be things explicitly promised in Scripture, or maybe we take a promise of God and we interpret it a certain way, and because we interpret it a certain way, when God doesn't fulfill it the way we interpret it, we begin to doubt His promises. We begin to doubt those things. Just recently, I was talking with a young man, and he was going through some trying times, and he kind of got to a point where he kind of said he wasn't talking about God, but he was talking about some other things, and he said, well, they really let me down. And I said, now hang on a second. I said, it's not that these people or that God, because I put that in there, God let you down. It's that you are wanting things your way in your timing, and you're not trusting the Lord and His ways and His timing. You got an idea in your mind about how you think it should be and when you think it should go down, and yet when it didn't happen that way, now you're feeling like you were betrayed, and you need to trust the Lord and trust His process and trust what He is doing. And I think that that's something we do often as well. When God doesn't work according to our time and in the ways that we think He ought to, we begin to doubt Him and we begin to doubt His promises. Sometimes we can only see what we see, and we can't see what God is doing in the grand scheme of these things. And because of that, we begin to doubt God. I think one of the biggest ways that we see that sometimes in our lives is when we lose a loved one. and it's hard for us to understand why God would decide to call that person home or to remove that person from our life. And obviously we wanted God to do something different. And that creates a challenge for us to then trust God and His goodness in the midst of that loss and in the future as we begin to continue living life dealing with that loss. And so those things happen, and they cause us to doubt. And it's true for God's right-hand man here, and it's true for us. So we don't want to be too quick to condemn this man. The captain's doubt would lead him to miss the opportunity for God's blessing. And that's something we need to be reminded of, is that when we doubt God and doubt His goodness, we ultimately miss out on the opportunities for God to bless us. And this is something that let's continue on. Let's look at 2 Kings 7. We're going to read verses 3 through 8. As we do so, I want you to listen for the desperate plan hatched by the 4 men with a skin disease. So check this out. It begins in verse 3 saying this. Now 4 men with a skin disease were at the entrance of the gate. They said to each other, "Why just sit here until we die? For if we say, 'Let's go into the city,' we will die because of the famine in the city. But if we sit here, we will also die. So now, come on, let's surrender to the Arameans, surrender to their camp, and they will let us. If they let us live, we will live. But if they kill us, then we'll die." So the disease got up at twilight to go to the Aramean camp. When they came to the camp's edge, they discovered that no one was there, and that the Lord had caused the Aramean camp to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a large army. And the Arameans had said to each other, "The king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to attack us." So they got up and they fled at twilight, abandoning their tents, horses, and donkeys. And the camp was intact, but they had fled for their lives. Verse 8 says, "When these diseased men came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent to eat and drink. When they picked up the silver and gold and clothing, they went off and hid it. And they came back and entered another tent, picking up things to hide them." And we're going to stop right there. So what we see is we have 4 men who in their mind there was almost no hope for survival. In fact, the only hope for survival was to surrender themselves to the Arameans. If you think about it, I love that they're kind of weighing out. They're saying, okay, if we decide to kind of break our separation from the city, because these are people with a skin disease, if we choose to just break that separation and go into the city, we're still going to starve to death. We're still going to die because we're going to starve to death with the rest of the city. If we stay outside of the gates, we're going to and just sit here and do nothing, we're still going to starve to death because there's no one here that's going to help us. There's no one here leaving us anything. They can't beg, they can't do anything. Well, if we go to the Arameans and we surrender ourselves, there's a chance that they might kill us. But we're going to die here anyways. But if we go to the Arameans and they decide to spare us and maybe put us into slavery or maybe do anything else, they'll feed us, they'll give us water, and there's a chance that we might live. So they had 4 options. They really had 3 options with 4 results. They had do nothing and they'll definitely die. They have to go into the city, stay with the city, and they'll definitely die. And then they had go to the Arameans, and then there's a 50-50 shot whether they are spared and live or they're killed immediately and they die. Well, that's kind of the best option. If 2 of the 3 options have a 100% chance of death and one of the options has a 50% chance of death, then that's probably the option you're going to take, and that is the option that they do take. And so they go and they get there and they realize that something dramatically different has happened. I want to look again. So we've seen the rationale of verses 3 and 4, and then the book asks this question. I want us to answer this. Pause the video and answer this. It's this: how can desperate times place people in a position to see God work? What are some ways that God works in both ordinary and extraordinary fashion? Take a couple minutes and discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, I know that sometimes God really has to just push us and thrust us out of our comfort zone in order to allow us to really move in fantastic ways. And I've noticed this even a lot in a lot of my ministry friends and kind of the way that God moves in them, where suddenly, they've been someplace, they've been very comfortable, maybe at a certain ministry position or in a certain church, and then because of changes in the church, because of sometimes bad things that happen that kind of really force a change upon them, and they end up trusting the Lord and moving into a new ministry role. Maybe it's a new ministry role in the church. Maybe they're a youth person or an administrative pastor, and the senior pastor leaves and they go into that position. Maybe they go to a point where they can no longer continue doing ministry in a church, or that church's ministries have kind of outgrown them, and they end up moving into another area of life. Maybe they just get to the point where they're no longer called to children's ministry or youth ministry, and so they go into an administrative or a discipleship or even a senior pastor role. And they really feel like that change has been forced upon them. It's not necessarily something they wanted to do. It was not necessarily something they sought to do, but rather they felt like they had to if they were going to continue to serve God faithfully. And then they saw just a tremendous amount of blessing from that. They saw God's gifting on them begin to shift, and God was very clearly in the midst of all that was going on. They saw ministries flourish. They saw churches become reignited for various reasons. And God just ends up doing just these wonderful, fantastic things. And I think God does that. I think sometimes we get very settled in and content in our situation, and we think that nothing's going to change. And so God ultimately has to push us out the door. I even feel like when we look at the book of Acts and we see kind of that initial founding of the church in Acts chapter 2, that church stayed put in Jerusalem for a very long time, and it wasn't until the persecutions of Saul, who would later become Paul, and the scattering of the church that we begin to see this Christian movement move beyond Israel and move beyond really just Jerusalem into surrounding areas and being proclaimed to the Gentiles, and really the movement that has led to there being a church here in Tunnel Hill, Kentucky. And so that's a tremendous thing, and I think God will move us and even push us in those ways. And sometimes those ways appear very ordinary, but sometimes they do also seem to show up in extraordinary ways. So let's keep looking. I want to look at verses 5 through 8 again. And as we do that, I'm going to reread them, and I want us to think about how surprised these people were. It says that, so the diseased men got up at twilight to go to the Arameans' camp. And when they came to the camp's edge, they discovered that there was no one there, for the Lord had caused the Aramean camp to hear the sound of chariots and horses and large army, and the Arameans had said to each other, "The king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to attack us." So they had gotten up and fled at twilight, abandoning their tents, horses, and donkeys. The camp was intact, but they had fled for their lives. When these diseased men came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent, they ate, they drank, and they picked up the silver and gold clothing and went off to hide them. And they came back and entered another tent and picked up more things to hide them. I love what we see happen here, because you get a clue on what was happening. You kind of get told this is what happened, and I love that it says that they started coming to the camp at twilight, and it was also at twilight that the camp started to hear chariots and horses and armies marching, and all they could do was hear it. But they were so scared by it, and they were convinced that the armies of Egypt and the armies of the Hittites, which is in present-day Turkey, were coming in from both sides to go after them, that they ran for their lives. And they ran for their lives to such a degree that they left everything behind. No one got on their horses to ride off, that everybody ran on foot, as we're going to see in the passage in a little bit, or really after the passage that we're reading today, that even as they went out and surveyed, that it looked like that the armies of the Arameans had literally been taking off their armor and taking off their clothes so that they could run as fast as they could to get away from these people. They left in a tremendous amount of haste. And these people walk in and are expecting, because fires are still burning probably. All of their stuff is there. It looks like just the camp should be sleeping. They probably expected to be halted by somebody standing guard, someone to kind of like raise the alarm, and there was no one there, and they probably started walking into the camp and could see that there were campfires still there and all that stuff, but no one was there. It was like a ghost town. And I imagine that was startling, but then when you think about it, they walk into their first tent and there's no one there, and there's food and there's water and there's clothing and there's gold and there's silver, and there's just this tent that has been stockpiled with this person, with whoever the soldiers was, their spoils and their provisions, and they were just like, yes. And so they went in and they ate and they drank and they loaded up all the stuff and took it somewhere to kind of start a stash, start a hoard, and even came back and went into the next one, and it was just like that one, and they were just overjoyed with all that they were experiencing. This leads the book to this question. It says, when have you dreaded a situation and realized later that the Lord had already taken care of it before you ever arrived? How did the situation compare to the experience of these 4 lepers? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, I hope you've had an experience like that. I can tell you that there have been myriads of times, so many times in my life, that I have worried and worried and worried over something, whether it was something in my control or something out of my control, and I've worried about something going on with church, something going on with my family, something going on with a relationship between me and another person, and I have been scared to death to deal with that situation. And then when finally the time came that I had to deal with that situation, I come to realize that the situation had already taken care of itself, that the needs had been met, that the people had been taken care of, that everything was fine, and that there was nothing for me to worry about. And I still had to deal with it. I still had to have the conversation. I still had to talk to somebody. But the fear of what was going to happen, and the fear that something bad was going to happen, never actually happened, and that really the Lord had already worked in that person's heart, worked in this situation, brought all the pieces together in a way that I was fine, and I had no need to worry, even though I was worrying horribly. And I think that's probably a little bit like what these guys were dealing with. I've never had to fear for my life and saying like, this is my only chance to survive, and so I'm gonna give it a shot. But there have definitely been times in my life where I have been worried sick about one thing or another, and then when it all came to the point to deal with it, God had already taken care of all the details. The book says this. It says, the 4 men were facing death and suddenly found themselves with an abundance of supplies. Their surplus created a dilemma. So let's read about that dilemma. We're going to read verses 9 through 11, and I want you to listen for what the 4 men decide to do about the supplies they found. So this is picking up in verse 9. It says, then they said to each other, we're not doing what is right. Today is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until morning light, our punishment will catch up with us. So let's go tell the king's household. The diseased men came and called to the city gatekeepers and told them, we went to the Aramean camp and no one was there. No human sounds. There was nothing but the tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents were intact. The gatekeepers called out, and the news were reported to the king's household. So what we see is the first thought of these 4 men was to gather all the food and the supplies for themselves. They'd gone in, they'd cleared out one tent, they went into another tent, planning to clear it out as well. It is no wonder that was their initial instinct, because everyone in desperate times tends to fend for themselves. This is actually something that I've talked about when churches go through hard times. I got a chance to kind of encourage one church when they were in the midst of transition. It was an unexpected transition. The pastor kind of left abruptly, and they weren't really, and it was a pastor that had been there for such a long time and had really taken over so many different areas of the church that his kind of sudden departure really rocked the church, and suddenly they found like this huge leadership vacuum. And I think even our church, even Tunnel Hill, during times like COVID and during times like when we've had bad dips in our numbers and we saw kind of people stop coming, and we were getting into kind of a very desperate place, that we tend to have this desire to circle the wagons, to basically say we need to take care of ourselves, we need to fend for ourselves, we need to focus on ourselves, we need to not worry about, reaching out to people or do anything like that. We need to just be focused in and driving ourselves, and taking care of ourselves and making sure we are comfortable and secure and are paying the bills and doing all those type of things. That's just natural. That's just a natural thing. It is natural when we feel like we are threatened, that we might be in trouble, to want to protect ourselves, and even to the point of that leading to almost a sense of selfishness, that we're not going to take care of other people because we need to look out for ourselves. And we see that in our culture. We even see that kind of promoted in our world today, where you always need to look out for number one and you're number one. Those type of things are very common, but they're not very godly. And it's actually neat that we see these 4 men who've gone into this camp, they find this abundance, and they kind of come to the conclusion or come to the realization that their initial selfish instinct was wrong, even to the point of saying that if we do this, we're going to probably ultimately be punished, that we're going to receive justice for our selfishness. There's even an aspect here when he talks about punishment, when he talks about our punishment catching up with us, is this idea of iniquity, that our sin will find us out, that what we're doing is sinful, and if we just keep doing what we're doing right now, that there's going to be a judgment, there's going to be harshness to come with that. In verses 10 and 11, we see the 4 men sharing the good news of the food and supplies with the city gatekeepers, who passed it on to the king. And then it asks this question, and I want to ask you this question: what are the dangers of failing to share with others the good news about God's provision? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. I like what the book says here, and it says this. It says, these men who were social outcasts might have felt justified in keeping the food and supplies for themselves. Finding the Aramean supplies literally saved their lives, but they made the sacrificial choice to share. And when you think about that, the reality is if they had not shared the good news of what they had discovered, that the people of the city could have died. If they had kept that all from themselves, if they stockpiled it somewhere and never let the city know what was going on, there is no question that many people would have died, maybe before they realized what had happened and went out of the city and maybe even found these people guarding their stockpile. That there would have been people that died, and then probably ultimately, when you think about these people, they would have died, because once the people found out what they did, they would have killed them. And so when we think about our obligation to share what God has done, and we're thinking specifically of the gospel, the reality is, and this is something you should think about, if we refuse to share the good news about God's provision of salvation to the nations, then we are ultimately making the decision to doom people to hell and death and separation from God for all eternity. And that's something we need to really think about. Is our own comfort and our own provision and our own sensibilities more important than the eternal destiny of another person? These men recognize the fact that if we keep this to ourselves, people will surely die. And so they made the decision to go and make this good news that God's provision, that God has provided for them salvation, literally, through this food, that they needed to go share that. And they weren't soldiers, they weren't kings, they weren't fancy people heroic fancy people who had gone out on some great mission or quest. They were outcasts who weren't even allowed in the city, which is why they had to call up from the city gate to the city gate, who ultimately brought the best news. And so no one is disqualified from bringing the good news. In fact, all of us are obligated to bring that good news. And that leads us to the last part of our passage. I want to read for you verses 12 through 15. And I want you to notice what the king does. So picking up in verse 12, we read this. It says, so the king got up at night and said to his servants, and said to his servants, let me tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know we are starving, so they have left the camp to hide in the open country, thinking, when they come out of the city, we will take them alive and go into the city. But one of his servants responded. He said, "Please, let messengers take 5 of the horses that are left in the city, and their fate is like the entire Israelite community who will die. Let us send them and see." The messengers took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them after the Arameans' army, saying, "Go and see." So they followed them as far as the Jordan, and they saw that the whole way was littered with clothes and equipment, and the Arameans had thrown off in their haste. The messengers returned and told the king. So we notice here that the king just can't believe it. He just can't believe it. And if you think about it, his right-hand man didn't believe it, so why would the king believe it? He just can't believe it. He's convinced that this must be a trap. You know, that old adage that if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. And so he wasn't going to do it. He was going to be like, this is a trap. They've probably already turned these leper people. They've probably promised them stuff. These guys are traitors. And if we go out there, then they're going to cut us off. They're going to slaughter us all, and they're going to take the city, and we'll have failed to protect these people. And bear in mind, these are people that are starving to death and probably dying as the days go on. And I love what we see from this follower of the king. He says, "Listen," he says, "we're going to die. Why don't you take a couple of servants, give them chariots so that they can go quickly, and send them out to see what's happening. Have them go pursue the Arameans and see if they really have fled or if they're waiting in the hill country." And so they do. They send out 2 chariots, probably the last few horses that had enough nutrition and enough strength to really go out and to pull a chariot, and he sends them out, and they go throughout the whole country. They go as far as the Jordan River. They look out upon the whole country, and they recognize that indeed the Arameans have fled. They can see the path in which they've fled and how they've discarded clothing and equipment as they've gone, and they finally know that this is real, and what we're going to read, what we see in the future passages, that the people go out and Elijah's prophecy is fulfilled. I want to ask this question, and this isn't going to be our last question, but I want to ask this question. It says, "In what ways was the king's reluctance and the servant's encouragement similar to the story of Naaman's response in bathing in the Jordan River?" And I want you to think about that for just a second. If you don't remember the story, or maybe this is the first video you've watched in a while, in last week's study, Naaman was a man with leprosy who came to Israel because he was sick and he was dying, but he was a very important soldier and member of the court of one of their neighboring nations, and he wanted healing. And Elisha didn't even go out to meet him, but just said, "Go to the Jordan River and wash yourself 7 times and you'll be clean." And Naaman was mad. He thought that they were going to do a big show, that there was going to be a big moment, that the prophet was going to come out and do something cool, and then he would be healed. And he was very annoyed that not only did the prophet not even come out to see him, but then just told him to go wash in a river some 20, 30 miles down the road. And he thought to himself, he says, we've got better, bigger, more beautiful, majestic rivers in my home country. Why would I go to the Jordan? And what happened was this servant kind of said, "Listen, what have you got to lose? You're here. This is what this man is saying to do. We've heard that he can do amazing things. What have you got to lose?" And so begrudgingly, really, he said, "Fine, let's go try it." And he goes and does it, and ultimately he's healed. In the same way, our king here is like, "No, this is a trap. This is too good to be true. I can't believe it. I won't believe it. We're going to be in trouble." And the servant again steps up and says, "We're going to die. Our situation is peril. We are in a bad situation. And if we send a few people out, the worst case scenario is the Arameans catch them and kill them, and they're no worse off than they would be, but at least now we know that, in fact, we need to stay put and that we're not safe." And so they do, and ultimately come to the decision and come to the realization that the good news is true. I want you to look at, I'm going to read what's kind of the last part here. It says, "This story reminds believers of the necessity of sharing our faith. We have a responsibility to share with others the goodness and the grace of God. Some have defined evangelism as simply one beggar telling another beggar where the food is." We find that in the Ragamuffin Gospel. And that's exactly what these lepers did. That is what we are also called to do as well, that we are to tell people what they must do to be saved. The rest of the story is that Elisha's prophecies came true. The people of Samaria collected the soldiers' food and supplies, and everyone had food to eat and sold at the exact prices that he mentioned, the exact prices that Elijah had foretold in his prophecy. Unfortunately, including also the man who would ultimately not get to taste or experience that. And with that in mind, I want to close with this question. What evidence do you see that God is able to bring hope out of what seems to be a hopeless situation? When you look at your life, when you look at things that have happened, what evidence have you seen, have you experienced that God is able to bring hope out of hopeless situations? As we do that, we want you to close our discussion with this question. Close your time in prayer, and then we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. We are both in person and we are online through Facebook Live. We hope you will join us. I'm going to ask you that question one more time. What evidence do you see that God is able to bring hope out of what seems to be hopeless situations? Discuss that, close in prayer, and then we'll see you at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much. God bless.